What was so great about the Romans? Is the conquest and holding of most of the Western world over generations sufficient to demonstrate Romans' greatness? The greatness of conquest is related to the people that Rome conquered. The sterner the competition, the greater the triumph, and the greater the greatness. In this, the people of the time were no match for the Romans. As we see their deficiencies, we get a glimpse of the greatness of the Romans, perhaps. We see a treatment of these peoples in chapters 4 and 5. 4, which treats the Gauls and the Carthaginians, and 5, which discusses the condition of Greece, Macedonia, Syria, and Egypt after the reduction of the Carthaginians. So this video concerns these areas, the competitors of Rome, as a means of providing the background for understanding Rome's greatness. Consider some history here, so we know what we are talking about. The reason I am telling this history is that so we have an idea of when the Romans were great, or the greatest, according to Montesquieu. Did Rome have a golden age when its greatness was most evident? If so, when? If not, why does Montesquieu not talk about that? Certainly it was a preoccupation of all ancient historians who treated Rome. So let us consider Rome's adversaries. The first thing to notice is that Rome's adversaries are those that involve the move from the Republic to the Empire. All the adversaries that Montesquieu considers systematically are those that fought Rome starting about 250 years after the expulsion of the Tarquins. Rome finally took most of the boot of Italy in 270 BC, as can be seen in this map of Rome's conquest of Italy. Rome was not even a sufficiently important regional power to warrant mention in Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, as Montesquieu mentioned, which ends around 300 BC. Xenophon does not mention Rome in Hellenica, his account of the end of that famous war between Athens and Sparta. Look where Rome was at that time, as it is marked in red and salmon red on this map. It is nowhere near Sicily. It is stuck in the middle of the Italian boot. Not until it defeats the Samnites in war, and takes the orange part of this map, does Rome become the undisputed regional power of central Italy. On this rise, Montesquieu does not provide much by way of systematic analysis, except at the very end of chapter 1 on the beginning of Rome, where he mentions the warlike character of the people against whom Rome had to fight. Did the greatness of Rome lay in this accomplishment? That is, the consolidation of central Italy? Montesquieu never says so. The Roman defeat of Carthage is really about what are called the Second and Third Punic Wars. The First Punic War having taken place in a fight between Rome and Carthage over Carthage's one-time colony of Sicily around 250 BC. The conquests of that war appear in the almost fluorescent yellow of the map here that includes Sicily, Sardinia, Alba, and northern Italy itself. With the end of that war, Rome has Italy and the surrounding islands. The Second Punic War takes place between 215 and 200, and it involves Hannibal invading Italy, and eventually Scipio Africanus, who took the fight to Carthage and defeated Hannibal at the Battle of Zama in 203 BC. The Third Punic War is the utter destruction of Carthage, and that happens at approximately 150 BC. As Rome is defeating Carthage in the Third Punic War, it is undertaking efforts in Greece in what is called the Macedonian Wars, which also end in about 150. The First Macedonian War began as the Macedonian king Philip attacked Rome's client states, while he thought Rome was preoccupied with its fight against Carthage in the Hannibal era. The final defeat of the Greeks in the Macedonian Wars happens at about the same time as the last Punic War. The end of this war coincides with the expansion of Rome beyond the Italian boot. We need a new map. Rome, after the Punic Wars, has expanded to the medium purple areas to include Spain, Carthage and its regions, Greece, and the coast of what is today called Turkey, but we will call Asia Minor. Thus the end of Rome and Carthage and Macedonia. Rome's conquest of Syria happens later. This episode really happens around the time of Pompey the Great, who became the Great when he won great victories in the East. Date this stuff around 65 BC. On our map here, the conquest is the one in hot pink in the Middle East. The Roman conquest of Egypt takes place a bit later and was headed up by Julius Caesar first and completed by Caesar Augustus. That conquest on our map is here in orange and the hot pink of Africa. The hot pink of France or Gaul, as it was then called, is Julius Caesar's accomplishment. So Syria, Egypt, Carthage, and the Greeks were Rome's civilized competitors in its effort to build an empire. He doesn't say overmuch about the Gauls at this point, just a few words at the beginning of chapter 4 stating how the Romans divided and conquered this people. Was this when Rome had achieved its greatness, after its achievement of this smallish empire? Once again, Montesquieu does not say. Montesquieu makes clear that the Carthage against which Rome was fighting was already corrupt. It used mercenary soldiers. It proved a harsh master and was unpopular against those with whom it war and won in its area. Carthage was rent by significant factional conflict between the ruling rich and the oppressed poor. Carthage had what Montesquieu calls a bad government on page 47. Rome, in contrast, was healthy, vibrant, united. Montesquieu professes great admiration for Hannibal, whom he calls an extraordinary man, whose invasion of Italy presents what Montesquieu claims is the finest spectacle presented by antiquity. How did Rome win against this fine spectacle? Montesquieu gives two important answers. First, he says, the Senate never departed from its old maxims, and those old maxims prohibited Rome from making peace with enemies that were on its soil. This policy made the Romans a marvel of constancy, he says. Second, according to Montesquieu, Rome was saved by the strength of its institutions. These institutions consisted of subordinating the family to the state. Women could not shed tears in public after the Roman army was annihilated at Cannae. Another institution was the Senate. The constancy provided by the Senate, which headed up the political community's effort to identify talent and keep the faith in its effort to turn back the Carthaginian menace. So if the greatness of Rome is demonstrated in its victory over Carthage, and the victory is traceable to its policy and its institutions, then we must look to its policy and its institutions for its greatness. But we will see that the institutions did not survive the victory. And this is a big conundrum for us as we seek to understand Rome's greatness. But back to the competitors. Let it suffice to say about Greece, Macedonia, Syria, and Egypt, the nations that Rome vanquished after it had conquered the Carthaginians, that all of them suffered from decisive and quite easily exploitable weaknesses. As Montesquieu writes while introducing this topic, after the reduction of the Carthaginians, Rome had almost nothing but small wars and great victories, whereas before it, it had had small victories and great wars. Greece generally had extraordinary factional conflict, both within its cities and among its cities. These Greeks had only small republics that had learned to be dependent after Alexander's successful invasion from Macedonia. Greece maintained peace with a balance of power, but the big boy, badass Romans destroyed any semblance of that, and they divided and conquered the Greeks. Montesquieu describes this process in chapter 5 with precision and admiration, it seems. Syria and Egypt proved to have people who were easy to conquer and who only wanted masters. People who were uninterested in fighting because they enjoyed luxury, they were vain, and they were lazy. Events had taken place that had weakened the power of Syria considerably, Montesquieu writes in chapter 5. Egypt could have been a formidable power, but the cruelty of its kings, their cowardice, their avarice, their imbecility, their frightful sensuality, made them so odious to their subjects that most of the time only the protection of the Romans kept them in power afterward. It would be wrong to call these victories easy for the Romans, but these victories were pretty easy for the Romans when compared to their victories over the Samnites. The other countries were misgoverned and corrupt and did not like war. They were not organized for war as a matter of political institutions, manners, or policies. Therefore, the Romans conquered. The paltry competition explains the Romans' victories, but that is not enough. Why were the Romans themselves not paltry, or weak, or ill-governed, or corrupt? All of these are relative traits. Corrupt compared to whom? Weak compared to whom? What accounted for the comparative excellence of Rome's institutions? And what accounted for the comparative excellence of Rome's policy? To that we turn next.